Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. We're going to talk about something I would like to say is happening sooner than you think. It's actually happening probably too late and should be happening much faster, which is diversity and inclusion in the workplace. So today we're going to talk about, of course, women in the workplace, in the tech ecosystem, but more broadly, inclusion for everyone involved in the tech ecosystem, whether it be the workforce or investors or going beyond that. So I want to get things started by giving a bit of a state of play of things. Now, of course, you guys can send in your questions and we'll take them as we go along. So don't hesitate to do that through the app. But first, I really want to do a state of play, maybe starting with you, Dimitra. How bad are things?
Things are considerably bad. So we have, in the UK, we have about 20% of the STEM workforce are women. So that's quite low. In the tech sector, the numbers are even lower. So we've got about 10%. And when we look at data scientists and AI scientists, the numbers could be even lower at about 5%. And that's anecdotal data for data scientists and AI. But I think there are very positive messages as well, as businesses have realized the value in having diversity and gender balance. There is a business case, that businesses that have higher diversity have better results, and we can add value to the economy. So things are improving, but they are improving with a very slow rate, and we can do quite a lot of things to improve much faster.
And looking at the chart that's coming up behind us is the percentage of female executives at the big companies in tech, Apple, Netflix. I mean, what's the high part of that chart there? 40% at best. That's better than we expect, right? The lower figures around 15%. So, as you mentioned earlier, it depends the fields that we're talking about, I guess.
Exactly. So that 40% is probably across the whole organization. But when you look at STEM, when you look at scientists and engineers and mathematicians, then the numbers are much lower.
Kathy, I want to go to you. So you're the architect of the ethical AI practice at Salesforce. It's a promising title. You've been in the tech industry for 20 years. Can you talk a bit about your personal experience and how you've seen things evolve over those 20 years?
It's been tremendous. So I received my degrees at Georgia Tech, being a university where there's one woman for every 5 males, and very challenging environment to be able to get through, with the assumption always being made that I got in simply because I was a woman, not because of my grades or my ability. And then my first tech job, similar assumptions were made, and it didn't help that coming from Georgia, I had a very, very thick Southern accent, which isn't looked upon very positively in the U.S. And so I had to work very, very hard to get rid of that Southern accent so that I could be taken seriously. For myself, it has gotten easier. I think that with seniority, with experience, comes that respect. But younger women face challenges in being taken seriously, having their voices heard. And I still hear stories from colleagues where they're in meetings with executives and they still get spoken over. And so it remains a challenge of having your voice heard and being accepted and respected for what you can bring to that conversation, but just in a different style, perhaps, than what the other people in the room are used to.
Vivian, I want to go to you with the next question. I mean, the business case for diversity, for having more women in the workplace, but more broadly, having more diversity in the workplace, that business case has been made. There's been a series of studies showing the benefits of that. Why is that not enough to convince people to actually take action?
Well, people don't live in the world of averages. And so when you see a report or a general trend that you hope is true for your company, et cetera, you're not actually going to take action on that. It's got to be specific to you. So the companies that have made, and you see several of them on that previous chart, that have made significant progress have tailored the business rationale to their business, which means they don't necessarily focus on every aspect of where you can apply more diverse cognitive diversity into technology for better outcomes. They focus on the 2 or 3 things that make a big difference for their business in their area. So in the case of McKinsey, that's really going to be about incoming talent and pulling from more diverse disciplines and a broader range of cultural, socioeconomic, and analytic backgrounds, different types of problem solvers to better equip our clients. So I think the general case is made that there is a relationship. The most successful companies, both in shareholder value creation as well as profitability, are more diverse in many ways than the laggards. And the performance differential is very big. The companies in the top quartile are 20% more likely to outperform those in the bottom quartile. So it's a big prize. It's definitely the case on average, but executives, founders are not going to act until they know how it helps their specific company. So that's what I'm encouraged to see a lot of firms are doing, is figuring out what's the value proposition for our case.
I mean, we've seen a lot of innovation, coming on the market and within companies as well. So far, and a lot of money being produced around that innovation. So far, has that innovation benefited, a group of people that are basically, what you imagine to be your typical engineer, a 40 or 45-year-old white man, or are the people benefiting from that innovation actually a broader group, whether it be the investors, the VCs, the entrepreneurs themselves? Maybe we'll start with you.
I think one of the roles that's needed, one of the ways that we can bring much more diversity into AI in particular, is bringing in skills like ethnography, psychology, user research, economics, understanding the broader span of people that are impacted by technologies. I think many people have become aware of the unintended consequences that have developed from technology, where it's a very homogenous set of individuals, young white males, in the stereotypical Silicon Valley hoodie, that's developing technology that meets their needs, that solves their problems, without thinking about the problems that, for example, people in rural Georgia, where I grew up, that they might be having. And so we need individuals that are able to go in and understand and then communicate more broadly what are not just the intended consequences, but the unintended consequences, and force everyone working on these teams to ask the question, not just, can we do this, but should we do this? And be much more responsible in the creation of the technology so that it does benefit everyone and not just that 1% of creators.
We're going to spin things forward, later in the conversation, but maybe sticking to the innovation we've seen so far. Have we seen it benefit a broader group of people, or is it still the kind of usual candidates, usual suspects?
I think we start seeing an increase on diversity, and I think companies, especially tech companies, understand that that would benefit the broader consumer base they have. The more diversity they have, the more diversity they have in their products, and we see that now they're trying to find ways to include women or other underrepresented groups there. The question is how they can do that, and they can do it, although they're STEM-based, so they're predominantly engineers, they can include, as you mentioned, they have to include other subjects such as psychology and bring the broader understanding and the broader perspectives of the market within their teams.
Okay, so before we dive into the future, I have a really good question from someone in the audience who says, even when you have the best intentions in the world and you want to hire women, how do you get over the issue of not getting female applicants for some of the jobs that you advertise?
I can start with that, and I'm certain the other panelists have something to say. So we recently did a study with Amazon, and we looked exactly at that, especially for tech. Mm-hmm. So what makes women respond to tech innovation, what brings them on board? And something that holds them back, especially for the applications for jobs, was the language used. Yep. So very often the language we use on the job ads is not tailored towards the broader audience. It reflects the male-dominant environment that we had so far. So that's something really important on how women describe themselves and what they actually apply for. So for us, it was very surprising that women didn't describe themselves as innovators. So even those that had patents and they had trademarks to their name, they wouldn't describe themselves as innovators. They would say they were problem solvers. So we have to approach it. We need to change the way that we have been thinking about attracting women into these jobs. And language is a key barrier.
And was the solution there for Amazon to change its language, or for the?
So we work with a lot of our members to help them to change the language they use, and they have seen significant increase of about 10-20% of the women applying for those jobs. Amazon is putting in place a specific project to attract more female talent and also to retain and train their talent. But we work with many other organizations that have done something similar, and it is about language is very significant, and we often don't pay too much attention to it.
It's also a really good example where the industry can work together, doing an initiative to create a larger pool of sourcing female analytic talent, which doesn't mean that you necessarily have to have even a technology degree. You could do collaboratively across an industry or a geography. So a much broader, larger, diverse pool of women or people who have other cognitive skills that are complementary to tech. It's an area where you can collaborate. Now, when you find someone who's super talented and everyone's competing to hire her, then you don't want to share that with your competitor. But there's a number of things, particularly around pipeline, as well as good practices in terms of creating a positive and inclusive environment, that frankly, I think tech companies should share good practices. If we're starting from an average of 20% women in the tech industry and probably much lower for other historically underrepresented groups, we have to do something radical of a much bigger scale if you really want to move that number. And if I said you were not going to meet your customer demand growth targets unless we did something radical, you'd think of a bigger answer. So we need a little more ambition, a little less patience, and I think some of the good ideas companies could share. When it comes down to hiring one person, fine, we can compete. Or one technology, fine, we can compete. But this notion of a bigger pool, more accessible industry, a bigger pipeline, and positive role models. There are even times when, for example, in professional services or banking or the mining industry, executives from other companies speak to different talent pools because we really just want to create a much bigger pool of diverse talent, and then hopefully many more women, for example, will come join tech.
I want to mention Pymetrics and Blendor. Those are two companies that use AI to increase the diversity of candidates that are hired for jobs. So rather than depending on looking at historically who have you hired and then making future decisions based on past hires, they recruit the candidates through what you might call non-traditional means. They're not going to the college fairs of all of the top colleges. They're not looking for people from the same cookie cutter mold. So they are sourcing candidates differently. They're looking for the same skill sets, but not necessarily with a CS degree. They've got those skills that are needed, but they don't have those labels that companies traditionally like to slap on it. I also want to mention AI for All. They take in high school girls and they train them on AI. And they are absolutely amazing. They're one of the graduates of their program. She got her AI paper accepted at NeurIPS last year, one of the most prestigious AI conferences out there. 2 weeks ago, I was speaking at the UN's AI for Good Summit in Geneva, and sitting next to me, speaking right after me, was a 17-year-old girl as well, who she did research on AI bias and inclusivity. So here are these 17-year-old girls. They don't have degrees from MIT and Harvard, but they are doing the most amazing work. And so if we want to increase the diversity, we really have to think very differently and stop putting ourselves in the same mindset, using the same labels of what the right candidate looks like, because it hasn't gotten us
far
anywhere.
enough.
Yes.
And if I were founding a business or maybe managing a fast-growing business, there's only so many things you can focus on. And if you care about having more diversity, ultimately of cognitive skills and diverse profiles in the business, 4 things. You do need a bigger, more diverse pipeline, and what are more creative ways that we can scale and even use AI to better identify the attributes and skills. Second is leadership positions. Appointing women and others with diverse profiles is strongly correlated with higher performance, particularly when you have more than, say, 20 or 30% of your decision-making from a diverse group of profiles. So not the one sort of token or trophy or superstar woman, the cult of onlyness, but rather critical mass that actually changes how you think about decisions and actually changes the decision-making muscle, if you will, in the company. The third thing is more productive, higher technology jobs. You can't have women or diverse profiles stereotyped into certain roles. You have to actually put them in the most important jobs, and therefore normally the most productive and also higher paid jobs in your business. And then last but not least is culture. A culture that really does look at ways that you can work in a more agile and flexible fashion. Many talented women leave where they're working today, or maybe jump firms, not just because there's a little more money here or there. It's the environment and culture in which they're working. You know, if the money were equivalent, you'd pick the best environment. If your daughter were choosing a place to work, you'd want her to choose a place where she'd have a fair chance of being treated well and being given good projects and respected as a professional, not place that paid a little bit more but didn't treat her properly and with respect. And that is a huge decision factor, particularly for historically underrepresented groups who have experienced not being treated well, experienced not being at the table. And so if I have a choice, I would never choose to be in an excluding environment. And those 4 things are most correlated with higher performance.
Very interesting. Let's spin things forward, a decade or 20 years and stick with you, Vivienne. McKinsey published a study, I think it was just a few days ago, about automation and bringing robots to the workplace and how that will affect the place of women in the workplace looking forward, up to 20, 25 years. Can you tell us a bit about the highlights that you guys found that were a bit surprising in your report?
Well, we've been doing work on gender in the workplace and the economic impact of diversity for 12 or 13 years. And what we've done differently, and it's marked in the report we launched this week, is really try and bring the same analytic rigor that we bring to all performance improvement to this topic. And so the biggest thing that's happening in the world of work, in the world, full stop, is technology. And so we wanted to understand what is the impact and differences of gender for technology and AI-intensive environments. So we looked at 10 different markets, 6 of them kind of OECD developed, mature economies, and then 4 fast-growth, larger economies, South Africa, Mexico, India, and China. And what we found is, first, the quantum of jobs lost and jobs gained is very significant for the economy. And what it means is approximately 160 million women will need to either substantially change their skill set, meaning the skills you have today will not allow you to do your job tomorrow, right? That level of retraining, or indeed your job might go away. That's 1 in 4 women in the world. So tech and AI revolution is as material as that. Interestingly, it's the same proportion for men, but where women then face additional challenges is the different starting points in sectors. So work today is very gendered. If you look at service and retail jobs or healthcare jobs, over 70% of those jobs are held by women today in developed and developing markets. They're very dominated by women. Similarly, manufacturing, construction, distribution jobs are often held by men. And so, like everything in life, it's a little bit about where you start And so that bias, the gendered nature of occupational level work, means that if you're going to scale in technology and create new jobs, like I would imagine that this notion of architecting AI and ethical AI exists in every tech company now, but it didn't 5 years ago. Literally new disciplines are being created. But if you're starting from a base, as you said, of only 20% women, it means we're going to scale that negative bias against women's participation. So the fastest growing parts of the economy are skewed male. The new jobs that will be created are skewed male. And the reskilling practices that you need to adjust your workforce, like a training course in the evening. It's much harder to do if you have children or more domestic responsibility than your male counterpart. Mobility, move towards the cities. Very hard to do if you're in a dual career household or your husband or your partner earns more than you do. Safety in the emerging markets. If it's not safe or culturally acceptable for you to be out at night on your own, even if you're going to an AI reskilling course, you don't go. So we have to recognize that women's starting point is different, and if we don't want to risk them moving backwards in their economic participation, you have to adjust how you kind of go after the reskilling opportunity for women. It just can't be the same way that you do for men.
Interesting. So we have to move as fast as possible, basically, before this further change and before automation actually scales. Otherwise, we're only going to end up with a result that's much worse than what we have today.
Interestingly, the quantum of change is the same for men. This is like a work transformation. And it's exciting because a lot of jobs will be created. There's going to be a lot of real growth. A lot of people are going to be lifted out of poverty. It's fantastic. It could be that, objective AI is better than human bias, but it has to be done quickly. And that's why in the report, we really set 2030 as a target, because it's soon. It's not this notion of over the grand cohort of time, by the time we're all dead, things will change. Reskilling, technology is changing the nature of work so quickly that if we don't change the approaches for women's participation and other historically underrepresented groups, frankly, they'll just miss the party. Yeah. And that will be bad for economic growth.
Dimitra, at WISE, you work to have more women in science, tech, engineering, manufacturing, construction. How do you take into account technological innovation and these new tech trends in the work that you do?
It's quite interesting you asked that, because what we've seen in the last 2 years, and it echoes what Vivian said, is that our members come to us and they want to have skill sets for their employees that they didn't ask for before. So we have a huge demand to help them find ways to get data scientists, AI scientists, project managers for tech jobs, and that comes from the broader industry, right? So you have mining companies, you have retailers, banks, tech companies, all that want data science skills and tech skills. So when we work with them, we explain what you've mentioned about retraining, reskilling women, because that is key. So the pipeline, the early pipeline, the girls that are now at schools, yes, we need to work with them and the families to actually make them more interested in new skill sets. But if we are to hit that target of 2030, we need also to work with the women that we have in the workforce now. So for us at WISE, it is quite a lot of the work we do is around enabling employers to retrain their women, to get women back to work, women that 15 years ago might have used Fortran or C++. So they need to learn Python now, and they do have the right skill set, the right competencies. It's how we approach that and how we make it inclusive enough for women to be able to take advantage of the opportunities. So tech for us is the focus that we have these years.
Kathy, this next audience question is definitely for you. It's about AI. How do we develop and study AI in a way where we maintain an ethical, moral, and equality standard?
This is a huge challenge for companies in thinking about a new way of working. We really have to change our processes. Right now, the incentive structures in tech companies are really based on launching products How much revenue are you generating? Getting more user engagement and clicks. And Tristan Harris described this as the extraction economy of tech companies trying to extract as much out of their users, and notice the word users, not customers, extract as much out of their users as they possibly can. And so if we're going to see a change, then we really have to change our model. It can't be ad-based, because if it's all about trying to make you see something and click on something and not just giving back, then that's going to be a challenge. So some of the things that we are doing, some of the things that we are doing is adding in methodologies like .everyone's consequence scanning. And it's a methodology that is meant to work in the agile development methodology cycle, where you spend 45 minutes asking questions about unintended and intended consequences. How do you maximize the positive? How do you mitigate the negative? And then we also have to think again about the incentive structures and how do we measure impact? How do you know if you have actually avoided harm because you've worked responsibly? That's a hard thing, measuring what didn't happen, and being able to think about what are the additional things that we can reward our leaders from. So we have to take both a top-down and bottoms-up approach. We need to develop an ethical mindset among all employees. We're seeing some of that in school programs, adding ethics throughout CS curriculums now. Doing more training, oaths, checklists for employees. But then it also has to be, those values have to be lived and rewarded by the executives so that you've got this holistic end-to-end model.
Very interesting. Sadly, we're out of time. I hope you can stick around, ladies. The audience had some interesting questions, including about what advice you have for women in the workforce who want to make it in the tech world. So hopefully we can stick around and discuss that one by one. Thank you very much for joining us. Very interesting.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you.